There is a substance that European dermatologists have been prescribing for more than 300 years that appears in ointments sold in pharmacies in Madrid, Barcelona, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City, that is listed in the pharmacopoeias of more than 40 countries, and that none of those countries calls by its real name or knows where it really comes from. It's called Balsam of Peru, and it doesn't come from Peru. It never came from Peru. Not a single drop of this resin has ever been commercially produced in the territory we now call Peru. The name is a mistake that is 500 years old, a colonial misunderstanding so profound that it has survived empires, wars of independence, 2 industrial revolutions, and the age of molecular biology. Even today, as I speak, someone in a pharmacy in Seville or Monterrey is buying a cream with that name on its label, unaware that the plant from which it originated grows on the slopes of a volcano in El Salvador, that it was the people who discovered how to extract it, and that the story of how that knowledge crossed the Atlantic and ended up with the wrong name is, at the same time, one of the most astonishing and shameful stories of colonial botany. But before getting to the mistake, we have to tell the correct story. There is a tree. It grows in the rainforests and on the volcanic slopes of the Central American Pacific coast, from southern Mexico to Honduras. Botanists know it today as Myroxylon balsamum pereirae, though for centuries there was such taxonomic confusion surrounding it that European catalogs classified it under dozens of different names. Toluifera pereirae, Myrispermum periferum, Myroxylon pereirae, among many others. It is a large hardwood tree with dark bark and a dense crown that can reach 16 to 18 meters in height when undisturbed. It belongs to the legume family, the same family that includes beans, lentils, and peas, though nothing in its appearance would betray this. Its flowers are small and white, its leaves compound and glossy, and in its bark, in the deepest layers of its vascular tissue, lies an extraordinary resin. To extract it, the Pipil, the Nahuatl-speaking people who inhabited the volcanic coasts of what is now El Salvador and parts of Guatemala, developed a technique that can only be described as a form of communication with the tree. The bark isn't simply cut, it's struck with wooden mallets, the blow repeated in the same spot for several days, until the tree reacts to the trauma and begins to secrete its resin as a defensive response. Then, small strips of the damaged bark are removed, and fire, a gentle, controlled fire, is applied to the wounded area. The heat causes the resin to flow. It is collected wrapped in cotton cloths, which are then boiled in water until the resin separates, rises to the surface, and can be collected clean and concentrated. The result is a thick liquid, ranging in color from reddish-brown to black, with an extraordinarily complex aroma. Balsamic, slightly sweet, with notes of vanilla and cinnamon, but also with a darker, almost medicinal background that lingers in the lungs for several minutes after inhalation. That smell was sacred to the Pipil people. Not in the vague and ornamental sense in which we use that word today. Sacred in the operational sense. The balm was part of healing rituals, rites of passage, and preparations that traditional healers, those called ticidal in other Mesoamerican traditions, used to treat war wounds, skin infections, respiratory ailments, and diseases they described as internal cold, a diagnostic category referring to deep infections of the chest and abdomen. The records that survive the conquest, fragmentary and filtered through Spanish writing, indicate that the balm was applied directly to sores and cuts, inhaled mixed with other vapors to treat coughs and shortness of breath, and used as a preservative for meat and fish in the markets the Spanish encountered upon their arrival. To understand the scale of this use, one must understand the territory. The Pacific coastal strip that today divides El Salvador from Guatemala and extends to southern Chiapas was, in the 15th century, one of the most densely populated regions in Mesoamerica. It lacked the monumental cities of the Petén Maya and the imperial capital of the Mexica, but it was densely populated by communities that lived off cacao, cotton, indigo, and fishing. And at the heart of this network of markets and exchanges, the balsam that came from the volcanic slopes circulated as freely as cacao. It was, quite literally, currency. There were communities that didn't produce it but used it, that obtained it by traveling for dozens of days, or that received it as part of the tribute they paid to regional lords. In early colonial documentation, it appears mentioned under the Nahuatl name of Xochioquetzal, which can be roughly translated as the resin of the flower or the precious resin, with that prefix Xochi, which in Nahuatl designates the beautiful, the valuable, and the sacred simultaneously. The Maya of the region, those who inhabited the highlands of what is now western Guatemala and the Soconusco, also knew it, though by different names in their own languages, and had their own uses for it. Colonial texts collected by Dominicans and Franciscans in the 16th century contain references to a resin used to heal sores that won't close, to remove the heat from carbuncles, that is, to treat what we would now call infected boils or abscesses, and to relieve chest congestion. The combination of antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, and mucolytic properties in a single natural substance is not a retroactive invention. It is the pattern of use that multiple distinct traditions independently discovered in the same tree over centuries. And that pattern of use wasn't empirical in the degraded sense we sometimes give to that word, the "let's see if it works" kind of sense. It was empirical in the rigorous sense, generations of observation, application, comparison of results, and careful oral transmission. The people distinguished between wounds that responded to the balm and wounds that didn't. They distinguished between small doses for the skin and the inhalation of vapors. They distinguished between fresh resin and aged resin, which has a different action profile. That level of refinement doesn't arise in one generation. It arises in 10. When the Spanish arrived on the Pacific coast of Central America, and the Spanish presence in what is now El Salvador formally began in 1524 with Pedro de Alvarado's expedition, although initial contacts occurred earlier, what they found both baffled and fascinated them. The balsam smelled unlike anything they had ever known. Their own field surgeons, who had witnessed firsthand the limitations of European methods for treating infected wounds, gangrene, septicemia, loss of limbs, observed that the people closed deep cuts with a speed that defied the principles of Galenic medicine they had learned in Spain. And they soon began using it themselves. The documentation of this use is early and specific. The Sevillian physician, Nicolas Monarides, who never crossed the Atlantic but received plants and substances from the New World through the port of Seville and studied them with a diligence that makes him the first pharmacologist of the Americas, published the first part of his work on American medicinal plants in 1565. In it, he describes the balsam with an enthusiasm bordering on astonishment. He calls it of marvelous virtue for healing sores and fresh wounds, notes that it heals sores that seemed incurable, and that it cleanses the corruption of gangrenous wounds. Monarides was a prudent and skeptical man for his time, who tested his claims before publishing them. His use of such language was significant. But even in Monardes's work, geographical confusion appears, albeit in an innocent form. He speaks of the balsam that comes from the West Indies without specifying a region. It is in the following decades, as trade becomes organized and export records are standardized under the colonial bureaucracy, that the error begins to solidify into a name. The port of Callao, in the Viceroyalty of Peru, was the major distribution hub for American goods destined for Spain. Not because everything originated there, but because the organization of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century functioned in a way that concentrated American trade in the major viceregal ports. Goods from Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of what are now Colombia and Ecuador were channeled to the major distribution centers from which the fleets departed. And in the customs records of Seville and Cadiz, when a ship arrived with resins, spices, and medicines from Peru, what that really meant was from America. From Peru in the broad colonial sense, which was equivalent to saying from anywhere south of the Isthmus of Panama or the Pacific coast of the Americas. The balsam that came from the volcanic slopes of El Salvador was transported by mule to the Pacific ports, shipped to Panama, crossed the Isthmus, and loaded onto galleons bound for Seville. In the account book, its origin was listed as Peru, and that was the name that stuck. Francisco Hernández de Toledo, the personal physician of King Philip II, who led the first scientific expedition to the New World between 1571 and 1577, was the first to attempt to correct the confusion. Hernández traveled throughout the territory of New Spain, which included Central America, with a meticulousness that is astonishing even today. He described more than 3,000 plants, animals, and minerals. He interviewed indigenous doctors, healers, priests, and merchants. And in his manuscripts, which remained unpublished for decades and were partly lost in the fire at El Escorial in 1584, he precisely identified the balsam trees in his royal territory, the volcanic coasts between what are now Guatemala and El Salvador. But Hernandez died, his manuscripts were partially burned, and the surviving fragments took decades to be published in a form that could correct the already established commercial narrative. By the time his work began circulating in Europe in the 17th century, the name Balsam of Peru was already too profitable to change. It was on apothecaries' formularies, doctors' orders, and merchants' contracts. Changing the name would have meant changing the price lists, and nobody wanted to do that. Throughout the 17th century, balsam ceased to be an exotic curiosity in Europe and became a staple of the regular pharmacopoeia. Apothecaries in Paris, London, Amsterdam, and Madrid incorporated it into their preparations for wounds, burns, skin diseases, chronic coughs, and parasitic infections. The most common formulation was the so-called Peruvian balsam ointment, prepared by mixing the resin with animal fats to make a direct applied salve. Recipes varied from pharmacy to pharmacy, but the central ingredient was always the same: the dark, aromatic resin that came from the Americas under that misleading name. In the convents of New Spain, those institutions that functioned simultaneously as pharmacies, hospitals, botanical laboratories, and archives of medical knowledge, balsam was a top-tier ingredient. The Poor Clare and Carmelite nuns of Mexico City, Puebla, and Oaxaca, who maintained the so-called convent pharmacies, had relatively easy access to it because it traveled from Central America to the urban centers of the viceroyalty before crossing the Atlantic. In the surviving 17th and 18th century convent recipe books, now preserved in ecclesiastical archives and the National Library of Mexico, it appears under various names: Balsam of Peru, Balsam of El Salvador, sometimes simply the balsam, as if there were no possibility of confusion. The nuns who used it knew, through their networks of religious and commercial information, that it came from the provinces of El Salvador and Guatemala. But they never had the power or the institutional interest to correct the trade name that was circulating in Europe. In 1643, the Flemish physician Thomas Johnson published an expanded edition of John Gerard's Herbal in London, describing Peru balsam with sufficient chemical precision, by the standards of the time, to identify its antiseptic properties. In 1683, the French pharmacologist Nicolas Lemery included it in his Cours de Chimie with detailed instructions for its use in dermatology. By the end of the 17th century, Peru balsam was part of standard medical practice throughout Western Europe, and none of the physicians prescribing it had any idea that the plant that produced it grew specifically in a territory now called El Salvador. The 18th century was the century of systematization. The great botanical expeditions organized by the Spanish, French, and British crowns arrived in the Americas with the explicit mandate to catalog and classify. The expedition of Hipólito Ruiz López and José Antonio Pavón to the Viceroyalty of Peru, which lasted from 1777 to 1788, was the most exhaustive of its kind for the Andean region. Ruiz and Pavón collected thousands of specimens, described hundreds of new species, and produced work that is still cited in systematic botany. But they also searched for the Peruvian balsam tree in Peru, and they didn't find it because it wasn't there. That could have been the moment for correction. If the royal botanists who had traveled throughout Peru for 11 years hadn't found the tree, someone should have asked where it actually came from. And indeed, the question was raised. But the response was curious. Instead of searching for the true origin, it was postulated that it must exist in Peru but hadn't yet been found, or that perhaps it grew in unexplored areas of the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. It was easier to assume that geography was incomplete than to admit that the name was incorrect. The Cesé and Mocinho expedition to New Spain, which took place between 1787 and 1803, did indeed find the tree in its correct location: the volcanic coasts of Guatemala and what is now El Salvador. Mocinho described it with botanical precision. But the Cesé and Mocinho collections met a tragic fate. The manuscripts ended up in private hands in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, were partially copied by the Swiss botanist Augustin Pyramus de Candolle and were not published in full until decades later. Once again, the correct knowledge arrived too late, too diffuse, to change a name already established in commerce and science. In the first half of the 19th century, when the Central American countries gained independence from Spain, the cultivation and export of balsam became one of the pillars of El Salvador's nascent economy. The area now known as the Balsam Coast, in the department of Sonsonate, El Salvador, with its volcanic slopes descending to the Pacific, was at that time one of the most valuable resin and dye-producing regions in all of Central America. The local producers, many of them direct descendants of the Pipil people who had mastered the technique centuries earlier, maintained the extraction tradition with a discipline that astonished the European travelers who visited them. The German naturalist Carl Sapper, who traveled through Central America at the end of the 19th century, left detailed descriptions of the process. The rhythmic tapping on the bark, the gentle fire, the resin-soaked rags, the boiling in clay pots. It was exactly the same method that colonial records had described 300 years earlier. The Salvadoran name for the tree and its product was simply balsam, or sometimes Balsam of El Salvador. That's Salvador, which in Spanish can be read as a reference to the country or to Jesus Christ the Savior, and which in the colonial mindset was used both ways simultaneously. For Salvadorans, its origin was obvious. It was theirs. It came from their volcanoes. It came from their families. But in European pharmacopoeias, in the catalogues of the large importers in Hamburg and London, it was still listed as Balsam of Peru. And that was the name that reached doctors, pharmacists, and eventually consumers. In 1875, the German Pharmacopoeia, one of the most influential scientific publications of the century, included Peru balsam under its incorrect name and with the description of American origin, provenance uncertain. That formulation, provenance uncertain, is perhaps the most honest ever to appear in a European pharmaceutical document on the subject, because at least it admitted that no one truly knew where it came from. For the Salvadorans who produced it, its provenance was not uncertain at all. It was their land, their labor, their knowledge. But that wasn't what mattered in Hamburg. The story of Balsam of Peru in the 19th century is also the story of how El Salvador built its export economy on a product that the world market recognized under another country's name. The value of balsam was immense. It was prized as a luxury, as a specialized medicine, and as a perfume ingredient, because its vanilla and spice notes made it valuable in the European perfume industry as well, and in the tobacco workshops of Seville and Havana, where it was used to flavor pipe tobacco. A well-managed balsam tree could yield resin for decades. 1 hectare of balsam trees, as the cultivated forests of the Salvadoran coast were called, represented a steady and substantial source of income. But that income arrived in El Salvador under someone else's name. And what's worse, it arrived with conditions imposed by others. European importers, especially the Germans from Hamburg, who dominated the Central American raw materials trade in the 19th century, set the prices, controlled distribution, and, when it suited them, adulterated the product by mixing genuine balsam with cheaper resins from other sources. The Salvadoran producer, at the end of the chain, received whatever the middlemen allowed him. There were attempts to change that structure. In 1882, the Salvadoran government under President Rafael Zaldivar actively promoted the direct export of balsam and tried to establish designations of origin to protect the product. They didn't have that term. Designation of origin is a 20th century legal invention, but the impulse was the same. Balsam from the hills of Sonsonate is distinct from anything else sold under that name, and buyers should know this and pay for it. The attempt was partially successful within Central America, but it never managed to change the name or the pricing system in Europe. And then came the 20th century, and with it something far more destructive than geographical confusion. Between 1920 and 1970, European demand for balsam steadily declined. Not because doctors had discovered it was useless, but for precisely the opposite reason. Large European and American pharmaceutical companies, having identified the active compounds in balsam, cinemates, benzoates, vanillin, and benzoic acid, had learned to synthesize them in the laboratory. They no longer needed to import the resin from El Salvador if they could manufacture its active ingredients in a chemical plant in Frankfurt or New Jersey. Natural balsam was displaced not because it was inferior, but because it was more expensive to obtain than its synthetic equivalents. For the producers of the Balsam Coast, this was a blow of unimaginable proportions, a loss of profound significance. Families who had preserved the same balsams for generations, who had learned from their grandparents how to tap the bark at the precise point, how to control the fire so the resin flowed without burning, how to distinguish a quality resin from an adulterated one by its color and aroma. These families watched as their knowledge, accumulated over centuries of practice, lost its market value. Not because the world had ceased to need healing agents and antiseptics, but because the world had decided it was more profitable to manufacture them in a laboratory than to buy them from those who had cultivated them for centuries. The decades of armed conflict in El Salvador, the period culminating in the Civil War from 1979 to 1992, finished off what remained of the traditional balsam industry. The coastal balsam groves, which required constant care and specialized knowledge to remain productive, were abandoned, burned, and neglected. The families who worked them moved to the cities or emigrated. The technical knowledge of extraction, passed down from parents to children through direct practice, was lost in a single generation. It wasn't destroyed by a decree or an explicit prohibition. It was destroyed by war, by poverty, and by the indifference of a market that had already decided it no longer needed it. Today, if you walk into a pharmacy in any Spanish-speaking city in the world and ask for an eczema cream or an ointment for minor burns, there's a significant chance you'll find Peru balsam, or its standardized technical name, Myroxylon pereirae, on the ingredient list. It's in the cream your doctor prescribed. It's in some preservatives for fine tobaccos. It's in certain base perfumes still made in Grasse in the south of France, with a tradition dating back to the 17th century. And in many of these products, the balsam no longer comes from the volcanic slopes of El Salvador. It comes from laboratories that reproduce its compounds synthetically or import resins from other sources, blending and standardizing them. The Balsam Coast still exists. The name outlived the industry that gave it its name. There are still some old balsam trees that no one planted in this century and that no one works regularly, producing resin that no one harvests. There are a few families, a handful, who maintain the traditional technique and sell the balsam in small quantities to specialized buyers who seek the authentic resin. But the scale is a shadow of what it once was. And meanwhile, in the pharmacopoeias of the European Union, in the formulary of the United States Pharmacopoeia, in the catalogs of cosmetic ingredients of the world's largest personal care product corporations, the name remains the same as the colonial merchant noted in his account book 500 years ago. Balm of Peru, from a tree that doesn't grow in Peru, with a name that no one corrected because correcting it would have cost money, with knowledge that was built up over centuries on the slopes of Salvadoran volcanoes, and that today appears in the ingredients of your hand cream without anyone, anywhere on that label, ever mentioning the people who discovered it. The compounds that make Balsam of Peru what it is are not a mystery to modern chemistry. They are, in fact, one of the most elegant examples of how 20th century analytical science came to confirm, compound by compound, what the people had observed empirically for generations without the need for a chromatograph. The resin contains a complex mixture of aromatic esters, primarily benzyl cinnamate and benzyl benzoate, which together can make up between 50 and 65% of its total composition. These are complemented by free benzoic acid, benzyl benzoane, vanillin, neuralidol, and several minor terpenes. Each of these compounds has documented biological activity. But what makes the balm especially interesting for pharmacology is that these compounds do not act in isolation. They act in combination, with synergistic effects that scientists have been trying to reproduce artificially for decades, and which they have consistently failed to fully replicate. Benzyl cinnamate was identified as the primary agent responsible for the antiparasitic activity of the balm, based on studies conducted in the second half of the 20th century. The most significant work in this regard was published in 1987 in the British Journal of Dermatology by researchers at the University Hospital of Göttingen, who demonstrated its effectiveness against the Sarcoptes scabiei mite, the cause of scabies, under controlled conditions. This same compound had been the active ingredient in conventional scabies treatments in Europe for decades, although in synthetic formulations that copied the natural molecule without acknowledging its source. Benzyl benzoate, the second most abundant compound, has documented antiseptic and antifungal properties. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2004 by researchers at the University of Heidelberg compared the antimicrobial activity of the natural resin against various bacterial strains, including Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, the bacteria responsible for most common skin infections, and found significant inhibition at the concentrations typically used in topical formulations. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, known as MRSA, is one of the biggest challenges in contemporary hospital medicine. The fact that a resin used by the Pipil people 700 years ago shows activity against it is not a mere anecdote. It is a finding that some researchers consider urgent. Free benzoic acid functions as a broad-spectrum antimicrobial preservative. It is no coincidence that the Pipil people used it to preserve meat and fish in their markets. They were, without knowing it from a chemical standpoint, applying a food preservative based on benzoic acid, the same compound that today appears as an additive in thousands of food products under the code E210 in European regulations. What the modern food industry discovered in the 20th century as a laboratory preservative, Central American communities had been using in their markets since at least the 12th century. Vanillin, present in small concentrations, has documented anti-inflammatory properties in cell models. A review article published in the journal Molecules in 2015 by a team from the University of Granada analyzed the bioactivity of phenolic compounds derived from vanilla and their structural analogs, finding that vanillin inhibits the production of pro-inflammatory factors such as tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6 in activated macrophage cultures. Peru balsam, which contains vanillin along with other compounds with similar properties, thus offers a low-intensity anti-inflammatory profile that explains why it works well in eczema and contact dermatitis, conditions where chronic inflammation is the core issue, not acute infection. But we must be precise here, because precision is exactly what distinguishes science from mythology. The same benzyl benzoate that makes Balsam of Peru an effective antiparasitic is also one of the most common contact allergens in contemporary dermatology. This is no small contradiction. The European Society of Contact Dermatology has documented for decades that Balsam of Peru is among the top 10 most common allergens in epicutaneous patch tests, the tests used to identify contact allergies in patients with chronic eczema. A significant number of people who use creams containing Balsam of Peru eventually develop sensitization to its compounds and experience precisely the worsening of the eczema the cream was intended to treat. The Danish researcher Niels Hjorth, who became a central figure in European contact allergy research in the second half of the 20th century, was the first to systematize the relationship between Balsam of Peru and skin allergies. His work, published primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, established that sensitization to balsam can generate cross-reactions with a range of foods and fragrances, including citrus fruits, tomatoes, cloves, cinnamon, and perfumes with spicy notes. A person allergic to Balsam of Peru may experience oral eczema or hives after eating an orange or drinking cinnamon tea, without knowing the connection exists. That's not a fact that enthusiastic herbalists usually mention. But it's real, it's documented, and it deserves to be part of any honest conversation about this plant. The Dermatological Institute of the Complutense University of Madrid has contributed to the study of allergies to Balsam of Peru in the Spanish population, with its own data showing that the prevalence of sensitization ranges between 3 and 8% of the patients with chronic eczema evaluated, which, extrapolated to the population as a whole, represents tens of thousands of people in Spain who are likely unaware of the origin of their reactions. This lack of awareness has a structural cause. The labeling of cosmetic and pharmaceutical products uses the Latin technical name, Myroxylon pereirae, which most consumers do not recognize as the same Balsam of Peru that their doctor mentioned during a previous visit. Thus, the colonial naming error has direct health consequences in the 21st century. A person who knows they are allergic to Balsam of Peru may not recognize the warning on a label that says Myroxylon pereirae resin. And a person who reads Myroxylon pereirae in a cosmetic ingredient may not connect it to the warning their dermatologist gave them about citrus fruits and spices. The fragmentation of knowledge, the same problem that caused balsam to lose its geographical origin, continues to cause harm in concrete and measurable ways. Research on balsam from El Salvador has been intermittent but not non-existent. The University of El Salvador, through its Faculty of Chemistry and Pharmacy, has conducted chemical characterization studies of balsam samples produced on the Balsam Coast, publishing several articles between 2000 and 2015 that compare the chemical composition of resins from different production areas and extraction methods. This research has a direct practical implication. If international pharmacopoeias want to establish quality standards for authentic Salvadoran balsam, distinct from adulterated mixtures or synthetic equivalents, they need the compositional data provided by these studies. It is the scientific basis for a potential designation of origin. The Central American Technological Institute, based in Guatemala, has been working in parallel on the properties of Peruvian balsam for applications in forest medicine and ecosystem regeneration. The balsam tree, whose wood is exceptionally hard and resistant, has properties that make it valuable not only as a resin producer, but also as a reforestation species in degraded volcanic soils. Studies published in the Costa Rican Journal of Environmental Sciences between 2010 and 2020 document that Myroxylon balsamum, specifically the pereirae variety, acts as a nurse tree in ecological succession processes, facilitating the regeneration of other species under its canopy due to its shade and soil-enriching properties. This means that restoring balsam groves is not just about recovering a traditional economy. It's about restoring an ecosystem. The connection between Peruvian balsam and culinary heritage has also begun to be studied more rigorously in recent years. Researchers from the Institute of Food Science and Technology at the University of Costa Rica published an article in the journal Food Chemistry in 2019 analyzing the antioxidant properties of balsam extracts under food preservation conditions. The benzoic acid and cinnamates present in the resin showed antioxidant activity comparable to that of butylated hydroxytoluene, BHT, one of the most widely used synthetic antioxidants in the food industry. This comparison is not trivial. BHT is at the center of a toxicological debate that has remained unresolved for decades, with studies indicating potential effects on the endocrine system at high concentrations. The fact that a natural compound used in pre-Hispanic food production has comparable activity warrants scientific and regulatory attention. And then there's the issue of cigarettes. Very few people know that balsam of Peru has been an ingredient in manufactured tobacco, specifically pipe tobacco and some fine cigars, for centuries. Master cigar makers in Havana and Seville used it to flavor blends, adding a sweet, balsamic note that smokers recognized as characteristic of certain quality blends. European tobacco houses imported Salvadoran balsam mixed with the tobacco before curing. This tradition still exists on a small scale among artisanal cigar makers in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Cuba, where some older master cigar makers maintain it as part of family recipes that haven't changed in 100 years. Not because it's better or worse than other methods, but because it's what has always been done, and no one has found a good enough reason to change it. If right now you feel that someone built an entire world on the work and knowledge of others without acknowledging it, and that this world continues to function without the mistake being corrected, subscribe to the channel, because the next story has exactly the same pattern, with a different plant, a different continent, and an injustice that has remained invisible for even longer. The good news, and there is one in this story, even if it comes late, is that the balm hasn't disappeared. It has survived, as many things do in Central America, stubbornly, marginally, and with a dignity that doesn't need anyone's permission to continue existing. In the municipality of Chilteupan, in the department of La Libertad, west of San Salvador, there are families who have been extracting balsam using the traditional method for at least 4 generations. They are not many, only a few dozen active producers, But they exist, and in the last 15 years they have found something their grandparents never had. A niche international market that values authentic resin and pays prices that justify their labor. The European natural cosmetics industry, that movement that is reacting against synthetic ingredients and seeking raw materials with traceable origins, has begun buying Salvadoran balsam directly from artisanal producers, sometimes through fair trade intermediaries, sometimes through direct contact established by university researchers who act as bridges. The price is, for the first time in decades, fair. Not generous, fair. Enough to make it worthwhile to maintain the trees, learn the technique, and pass it on to your children. The Balsam Producers Network of El Salvador, a small, under-resourced but functionally active organization, has been working since 2008 to document traditional techniques, establish its own quality standards, and manage the organic certification of the resins it exports. Its members are precisely the people that the official history of botany has never named, the descendants of the Pipil people who hammered the bark with wooden mallets long before Nicolas Monardes wrote the first European description of the product they had created. The Botanical Garden of El Salvador, in San Salvador, maintains a collection of balsam trees with genetic material from different areas of the Balsam Coast, as part of a national botanical heritage conservation program. It is a small collection, under-resourced, like almost everything related to heritage conservation in El Salvador, but it exists, and that collection could be the basis for future reforestation programs if political will and resources ever allow it. In the bustling market of Soyapango, east of San Salvador, and in the markets of Santa Ana and San Miguel, you can buy balm in small bottles sold by herbalists who recommend it for the same uses the Pipil people employed centuries ago: healing wounds, relieving eczema, and inhaling it for coughs. The price is affordable, the product is genuine, and the person selling it almost always knows firsthand or secondhand how it's produced. Because in that network of Central American bustling markets, knowledge of plants wasn't fragmented in the same way as in Europe. If you want to use Balsam of Peru, the authentic one, the one that comes from El Salvador, there are things you should know clearly before doing so. First, don't use it if you have sensitive skin without first doing a patch test. Contact allergy to Balsam of Peru is real and documented. Apply a small amount to the inside of your elbow for 48 hours. If there's no reaction, it's less likely you have sensitivity, though not impossible. Second, if you've already been diagnosed with a Balsam of Peru allergy by a dermatologist, keep in mind that this allergy can cause cross-reactions with citrus fruits, tomatoes, cinnamon, cloves, vanilla, and some perfumes. It's not the plant that's dangerous, it's your immune system responding to its compounds in a way that deserves respect. Third, do not use it during pregnancy without consulting a doctor. Data on its safety during pregnancy are limited, and European clinical guidelines recommend caution. Fourth, if you want to buy genuine resin and not a synthetic substitute, look for suppliers who specify Myroxylon balsamum variety pereirae, origin El Salvador, in their traceability documentation. That detail, which seems technical and minor, is the difference between the real product and a laboratory compound that bears the same name. And fifth, if you have chronic eczema that doesn't respond to treatment, consider speaking with your dermatologist specifically about Balsam of Peru, not as a remedy but as a possible allergen to rule out. Many chronic eczema cases that don't improve have an underlying sensitization to this compound that no one has investigated because no one has connected the cream the patient is using with the allergen it contains. The traditional Pipil knowledge of balsam, refined over generations, reached European pharmacology in the 16th century and never left. Today, it remains in creams, perfumes, preservatives, and dermatology laboratories. What didn't arrive was the name of those who created it. What didn't arrive was the recognition that there is a balsam coast in El Salvador, and that on that coast there are families who know how to make something that no chemical plant can exactly reproduce. The next time you see Balsam of Peru on a label, on a cream, a perfume, an herbal product, think of the volcanoes of Sonsonate. Think of the wooden mallets striking the bark. Think of the scent, balsamic, sweet, dark, that lingered on the hands of the Balsam Coast workers for days after the harvest. That scent comes from a tree with the wrong name. But the tree doesn't know it has the wrong name. The tree continues to produce its resin in the same place it always has, with the same majestic indifference it had when the Pipil people struck it with their mallets for the first time 800 years ago. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we unearth a chapter from nature's archives that someone, at some point, decided wasn't important to remember. There's a figure in the history of botany called a homonymous plant, a plant that bears the name of another, or a name that doesn't belong to it, wandering the world sowing confusion and attributing to the wrong places the glory of what it itself produced. The balsam of Peru is the ultimate homonymous plant. For 4.5 centuries it has carried the name of a place where it wasn't born, financing the colonial trade of half a continent with its resin, healing the skin of Europe while Europe gave it the wrong name. If trees could speak, the Myroxylon balsamum of the Chilteppan slopes probably wouldn't say a word. Trees don't need anyone to name them correctly to keep growing. That is, perhaps, the oldest and most silent form of dignity there is.